Hello and welcome to Greatness Radio. I am your host, Monica Carter-Tagore, bringing you information, inspiration, and occasionally even interviews to help you show up at your best. When you've made the decision to go for your own greatness, this is the place to be. Let's get to it. Your story has the power to heal, to teach, and to save. You know how I feel about your story. Your story holds within it your gifts. Your story holds within it inspiration. Your story holds within it your greatness. In fact, every single one of us has a story that can touch lives in some way, that can possibly transform lives in some way. Maybe that can even save lives in some way. But the thing is that most of us don't realize the potential of our very own stories. You see, we get so bogged down, we get so mired in the unfortunate things going on, in the bad experiences, in the negative perspectives, that we forget that our stories are much bigger than any single bad experience. But if you look at your story, if you look at the life that you're living right now, if you're looking at the story that is unfolding right now, if you were to examine it in an objective way, not just as the person who's in the midst of it, but if you were to examine it in an objective way, you would see that there are peaks and there are valleys, there are good things and bad things. You would see that there are positives and negatives. You would see that there are things to be celebrated and things where you think, oh my goodness, why did I ever do that? But all of that is part of your story. And part of my work with Greatness Radio is to help you to, of course, realize your potential, to realize and embrace your possibility for greatness. You can't get to your greatness without living your story, because your greatness is wrapped in your story. And so today, I just want to bring your attention to your story, the very story you are living. What great thing is happening in your story? Or what great thing has happened in your story? I have a video series about this topic, about the transformative power of your story, and specifically the saving grace of your story. But for now, in this episode, this podcast episode, I just want to talk about the saving grace of your story. You see, the saving grace of your story is that element of your story that is about change and that can inspire or provoke change in another person. So what part of your story can inspire somebody else to do something amazing? What part of your story can evoke a powerful emotion that can go and transform somebody's life? What part of your story can give hope and help and inspiration to someone else? That's the saving grace of your story. And that is the single element of your story that you can use to, again, transform your life and to transform the lives of those who are fortunate enough to experience your story through reading it in a book or seeing it presented on stage or reading about it in a blog or however you choose to share your story. And make no mistake, there are many different ways that you can share your story. I discuss a couple of them in my video series on the transformative power of your story, and I will share those 3 ways here. There are, as I said, many ways you can share your story. Of course, I most often discuss the idea of sharing your story in a book because, of course, I help lots of people with books. I have a book coaching program in Author Grow, as well as the fact that I have been a ghostwriter and editor for people in the past. So I have helped a lot of people tell stories in books, but books are not the only way to share your story. I know that one of the most inspirational and one of my favorite motivational speakers is Les Brown. And Les Brown shared his story from the stage, as we know. And even now, you can go and watch incredible YouTube videos, incredible YouTube clips of some of his most impressive speeches. And even if you're just sitting at your computer, if you're sitting at your desk or you're watching it on your smartphone, you can still feel the energy of that experience. You can still feel the energy of him sharing those experiences, and you can believe his story. You can be inspired by his story. He chose to share his story from the stage. He was, if you've heard any of his speeches, you know that he was abandoned in an old building, and he was adopted by a woman named Mamie Brown. In fact, that's how he describes himself. He is Mrs. Mamie Brown's baby boy. And so when he was in school, he was labeled retarded. He was held back twice. He had lots of disadvantages, but he did not let being held back in school and being weighted down by the low expectations of others keep him back, keep him from rising. He rose to become one of the world's most renowned motivational speakers, and that's why we even know his name now. That's why I'm talking about him now. And he did that around his story. He took his story to the presentation stage, where he was able to give presentations and talks to lots of audiences, even audiences of Fortune 500 companies. Another person, Bo Eason. Bo Eason took his story to the stage in a one-man play. He took his story to the stage in a play called Runt of the Litter. It's a story based on his life of the underdog finally doing well. And who wouldn't want to root for that? We can all root for the underdog. I know sometimes when I'm watching sports, if I don't have a particular attachment to either team, my mind and my heart would naturally gravitate to the underdog in many of those instances, especially when I hear the backstory and I get a glimpse into some of the players' lives, and those glimpses into the players' lives and the idea of the backstory letting me know why this team or why this player is the underdog. That really draws me in. That makes me want to root for that team or root for that player. I want to root for the underdog. And so I become emotionally attached. And that's what happened with Eason. He wrote this one-man play and performed this one-man play around the story of his life as this whole underdog, as the underdog finally doing well, and audiences all over that resonated with them. It really clicked with them. And so he was able to, after his NFL playing career was over, he was able to take his story and use it in a way to connect with audiences in an amazing fashion. Another person who was able to use his story is Robert Kiyosaki. And Robert Kiyosaki was probably the best known personal finance author of the early 2000s. I read his book, Rich Man, Poor Dad, and several of his others, but it was Rich Dad, Poor Dad that really made a difference for me. It made me see my earning potential. It made me see my work. It made me see my business in a different light. In fact, he told his story of his struggle and of his strain of trying to become financially successful, of hitting rock bottom and having to climb his way out of that hole and finally finding that success. He shared his story in a way where other people could relate to it. And also he shared his story as he wrapped life lessons around it. What he did was talked about his story in the context of universal themes we can all appreciate. Aspiration. We all aspire to do well in life. Success. We all want success in some way, even though we may define that success differently. Financial independence. We want financial independence. He shared his story, and when he shared his story, he wrapped it around these universal themes and these universal ideas that we all aspire to have. And in fact, he created a paradigm shift for a lot of people. He helped people to see that it's not enough to go to school, to get a good job, to make a good living. No, you must own something. And so he helped me see that I didn't want to just be a self-employed person owning a job, because even though I was working for myself, I was still just owning a job. I was working on projects that were related to what clients wanted, I needed to own a system. I needed to be a business owner. And he helped me to see that so that I could begin to make changes within my business so that I could have a different lifestyle. And eventually I could build products and programs and systems that could run and that did not require my constant attention and constant input, as would be the case if I were just to be self-employed and owning my job role, such as writer or whatever the case may be. So Robert Kiyosaki told his story, but he told it in such a way where he related it to common struggles and common aspirations of us all. And he helped us to see that the way we were going needed to change. He helped many people to see that it wasn't enough to simply go to school, to get a good job, and to make a good living. That was the old way of thinking. He presented an alternative. And that alternative was about owning something, being a business owner and not just self-employed, being an investor, being a producer and not just a consumer. And of course, his company has had various fortunes since the 2000s. But the point that I make here is that he used his story to be able to reach and touch lives in a significant way. So, and he did that through a book. So whether you want to share your story in the form of a book, or you share it on the stage as Les Brown did, or you share it on the stage as Bo Eason does, there are many different ways for you to be able to share your story. As I said earlier, of course, I certainly encourage people to be able to share their stories in the form of a book, because that's where I've been able to help people more often to share their stories. But if the idea of a book doesn't quite resonate with you right now, or you feel drawn to share your story some other way, that's fine. That's wonderful. The point here is to recognize the potential and the possibility and the greatness within your story. Recognize within your story that saving grace. What is the saving grace of your story? How can what you've experienced help someone else? How can what you've experienced touch someone else? How can what you've experienced teach someone else? And really, how can what you've experienced save someone else? I know it may sound like a bit of hyperbole to say that your story can actually save someone, but it's true. You see, you never know what someone else is going through, what someone else is thinking, is feeling, or is considering. And it's just possible that when you share your story, when you share that you went through a certain thing and you were able to overcome it, that may give that person who is in the midst of that same thing, that may give them the hope and the help and the inspiration to try a little harder, or to not give up right now, or to just hang on for one more day, and then another day and another day. That's the saving grace of your story. You never know whose life can be touched by your story or whose life can be saved by your story. You know for yourself if you've been through something devastating, and of course, if you live long enough, you will. If you've been through something devastating, you know how earth-shattering that can be. It can rock you to your very core. You might question everything you thought you knew about life. You may even wonder how you can make it through that same day, much less the next day. You may be so shaken up by that thing that you can't see how you can ever get out of it. But by some grace and by some chance, you get the encouragement you need. You get the inspiration you need. You get the information you need to somehow, little by little, put the pieces back together. And somehow you end up climbing out of that deep hole and you do something amazing with your life. You somehow are able to not only repair, but to recover and to somehow go forward and do something even better. That's the power of your story. And if you've been able to do that, if you've been able to climb out of that hole, if you've been able to somehow make sense of that terrible experience, if you've somehow been able to recover from that devastating thing, then you are in a position to be able to help someone else recover from that devastating thing. So what do you need to say? What do you need to share? What can you say right now within your story to help someone else? We've all gone through things, and that's why all of our stories have value. Of course, we must first figure out the best way to be able to present those stories, because it's not enough just to go and tell all of your drama or to tell your sob story. No one wants to hear your sob story. We all have various things going on, and everyone has their own sob story if that's what they want it to dwell in. No, people don't want to hear your sob story. They want to hear your saving story. So don't just dwell in the pit. Don't stay in the pit. That's not the story to tell. And if you're still in the pit right now, if you're still in that place where all you can see is darkness, all you can see is despair, all you can see is hopelessness and helplessness, then it's not time for you to tell that story. It's too raw for you. So just hold on for a moment. You've got some more work to do before you can tell that story. But if you've somehow figured out how to climb out of that pit, and you're better now than you were before, it doesn't mean everything is perfect, but you are a few steps farther along, then it may be time to tell that story. Because you see, you are a few steps ahead of somebody else who is still in that pit. You might not have all the answers, but you have enough answers to help that person figure out how to put one foot in front of the other, how to climb out of bed the next day, how to somehow make it through the day, how to somehow put a smile on their face, how to somehow keep going on. You know enough to help that person do that because you've done it yourself. So look at your story and see where the saving grace is. What can you share with somebody else that can touch their lives and that can transform their lives and that can possibly save their lives? I know a lot of times when people are wondering or thinking about if they should tell their story, they think, well, I don't know that I'll have anything new to say. Everything has already been said. And you know what? While it is said that there's nothing new under the sun, sometimes you can present what you know in a new way. It's true that somebody else may have already written a book on your topic. It's true that there may already be a movie about your topic. It's true that there may be a speaker who talks on your topic, but there has never been anyone to tell your story. So that's the newness that you can focus on. Tell your story through your eyes and in your voice, sharing your perspective. And when you do that, you may share an old truth in a new way. You may share an old truth that somebody may already know, but they may never have really seen it exactly the way you put it. The way that you phrase it, the way that you see it, the way you present it, that may be the new thing that really strikes a chord with them. Have you ever read something? Let's say a Bible scripture. Have you ever read a Bible scripture and you've read it 100 times before and you're like, okay, yeah, I know what that means, and you know, I've memorized the scripture, I know it. But then somehow a speaker, a preacher, a presenter, or someone else reads that same scripture and interprets it in a different way for you, and suddenly it just hits you differently. You see something new within those words, within that scripture that you hadn't seen before, even though you had read that scripture 100 times before. It's new to you in that moment because of how that person has phrased their analysis of it and how that person has presented it. And so it is with your story. Someone may know the technical advice you give. They may know the suggestions you share, but you may share that advice and those suggestions and those lessons in such a way, because of your story, because of your experiences, because of your perspective, that advice or those suggestions or those truths, they really strike that person differently. They hit the spot and they help that person really see themselves and see life or see a certain situation in a totally different way. And because of that, that person is able to make a life-changing decision, or is able to finally commit to something he or she had been struggling with before, or is able in some way to really go forward, all because of your words, all because of how you chose to interpret an event and how you chose to share. So don't be intimidated by the fact that, oh, there's nothing new under the sun, or, oh, I can't bring anything new. You can bring something new, because even though others have discussed your topic or have shared information that you may share, such as common advice or conventional wisdom, you may share it in such a way to where it strikes your reader, it strikes your audience in just the right spot. It helps them see something new that they can apply to their lives. Your story has tremendous value. Your story has power. And within your story is your greatness. So what can you do with your story now? Who needs to hear your story? Who needs to learn your perspective? Who needs to experience the lessons, blessings, and messages and insights you can share? What can you do with your story? I shared with you in the last podcast episode that I got some health news at the end of last year. And while it's serious, of course, I know that news and the journey I'm on will all be a part of my story. And I know that I'll be able to use that experience to be able to go and touch other lives. Now, I'm in the midst of living it right now, so I'm not at the point right now of sharing that story because it's still being lived. But I know as I learn more and as I live more within that story, and eventually get the distance so that I can look back and see the lessons, blessings, and messages that came out of that story, out of that experience, I know I'll be able to share it for the benefit of others, for the improvement of other lives, and to just somehow be able to touch other lives and to cause transformation and life change. I know that. I know the potential of that story. And so that story, as I said, is still unfolding for me now. But there are various other aspects of my story that are powerful and that I have shared and that I have been able to use to touch other lives. I started out as a novelist, and I wrote novels based on certain elements of my experience and certain ideas and perspectives I had, and those novels were powerful. I still get emails from time to time, even now, from people who tell me how one of my novels touched their lives. Now, my first novel came out 14 years ago, and to know that I am still getting emails and social media messages from people now who read books that are 14 and 12 and 10 years old, that's amazing for me, and I feel so grateful. I feel so grateful that whatever story I shared, whatever story I told is still touching lives. And so it can be for you. Your story can live on even as you continue to grow in it, and even as your story continues to develop. The portion of your story you share at one place in life because of what you've experienced, because of the chapters you've already lived, that portion of the story may serve to inspire and to help and to save someone at that time, even as you add more chapters to the story and as you live more. So I know, even though I started out as a novelist, and then of course I've written nonfiction books as well, I know that my story continues on, and this chapter that I'm living now, that will be a part of it. And at some point I will be able to share the insight and the wisdom and the blessings and the lessons that came out of that. But I'm not waiting around before working on my story. I've been working on my story a long time, and that's what I encourage you. Your story is constantly being lived as long as you're alive. So don't wait around to tell it. Tell it where you are now. That doesn't mean you have to tell all of the story, and it doesn't mean you have to tell the unlived parts, of course, because how can you tell the unlived parts when you haven't lived those yet? But tell the parts you already have lived. What lessons have you learned? What blessings have you seen that have come out of your story? What messages do you want to share? What story have you lived up to this point? How can that story help someone else, even as you continue to live, even as other chapters unfold? What story have you lived thus far? So examine your life and consider the saving grace of your story. What have you lived so far? Who needs to receive it? Who needs to learn from it? Who can benefit from what you've experienced, from what you've gone through, from what you've learned? Your story is powerful, and it has the power to teach, to reach, and to save. But it can only do that if you're brave enough to share it. Tell your story. Just tell your story. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to go to iTunes and subscribe. And tell a friend too, so they can live and breathe their greatness. And for more free information, inspiration, and ideas, be sure to go to monicacartertagore.com/greatness-newsletter and join the newsletter so that you get all of my best strategies, ideas, and information on freeing your greatness. In fact, go there now and you can get the Greatness Starter Collection, which is 3 free resources to inspire and inform you on your path to greatness. You have it in you? Go on. Set your greatness on fire.